Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Catherine McIntyre Peters, and I'm the Deputy Editor of Government Executive Media Group. Today's event explores how the at-home government workforce is solving challenges today and also how the future may unfold. So before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A button that allows you to ask questions of the speakers. We'll be fielding questions towards the end of the program, but we encourage you to submit the questions at any point along the way. If you experience any technical difficulties, just click on the help icon and a member of our team will assist you. This session is entitled Back to the Office. One day, most federal workers will probably return to the office, but how will agencies, managers, and employees handle that transition? What challenges will they face in the process, and what lessons from the at-home experience will they be bringing back to the office to improve operations and processes in the future? Joining me for this conversation is Sean Skelly, Commissioner on the National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service. Sean brings considerable expertise and perspective to this discussion. She spent 20 years on active duty in the Navy as a naval flight officer, retiring at the rank of commander. And as a civilian federal employee, she has served at senior levels of defense and transportation departments. And she has considerable experience as a federal contractor, supporting government missions from the outside. So thank you, Sean, for joining us. Let's just dive in. So tell us, how has the pandemic affected your work experience and that of your colleagues?
It's a pleasure to be here, Catherine. Thank you for having me on behalf of the National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service. It's an honor to be here. Personally, from my experience, I'm only a part-time federal employee. I'm a special government employee as a commissioner. So my day job is as a contractor supporting the Department of Defense. Honestly, like many people, retreated home in the third week of March, and since then it's actually been for my work about 80+% the same. From home, it's been incredibly informing as to what the possibilities are when government's gives itself the opportunity to respond with resources and permissions to go after it. But for me, I'm doing pretty much the same as I did in my company office, where it's been most different, aside from everyone's personal life, as we are as to how rarely most of us go out and only for very specific reasons. The only real difference with regard to my day-to-day work is my work involves a degree of supporting classified matters. And those are obviously things you cannot do from home. And it's not just logging on to a secure computer system. It's actually discussing things with people that are across the country, and where are the systems to allow you to do that, and how can you get into those places and and have a group of people able to access those things simultaneously has been probably the greatest challenge that the folks I work with have had to deal with. But it's been a group endeavor, and it's really been affirming as to how much people and how quickly and immediately people can pull together and do and have pulled together in this time.
Yeah, I'm actually, I've heard from a number of people who almost seem surprised by how quickly their organizations were able to adapt. And I think, necessity is the mother of invention, right? That sometimes you have to be pushed to something to really make it work. I'm kind of curious. Federal agencies spend a lot of time planning for continuity of operations during a crisis. I'm wondering, given your experience and what you've seen, have you been surprised by anything you've seen in the response agencies have had during the pandemic?
I've thought a lot about this question, and honestly, it's both yes and no. As I've understood it, and I had a little bit of an insight to it as being an executive secretary of a significant department for a little while, continuity of operations had several meanings before with regard to leadership and key personnel ability to maintain their jobs, to perform, to stay connected in different types of emergencies. Often that had to do with moving those people or giving them access away from the national capital region or whatever the department's normal workplaces. Or it had to do with maintaining access to all the vital systems and data and communications, which might mean data centers shifting around and the like, even if the department stayed put where it was. I don't think anybody really envisaged it would mean everybody go home, not just go to a remote site for certain people and the like. So while many of the components of previous continuity of operations planning are undoubtedly in play now, I don't think anybody foresaw this type of continuity requirement. So when I say no, I'm not surprised, because part of my history has been in the Department of Defense's rapid acquisition efforts and responding to the contingencies and the operations around the world that have been going on for 20 years now. And what people can do, what organizations can do when given resources and authorities to move fast and to achieve effect that might not be perfect, might not be ideal, but to make solutions happen, the best solution possible in the shortest time. So giving people the authority, giving them the resources and permissions to do things, I'm not surprised. Where I am surprised is absolutely how quickly, almost reflexively, most of the federal government, and where I'm most familiar day to day is the Department of Defense, went into action in terms of accessing things like commercial solutions that weren't being used on March 13th. Essentially buying Microsoft capabilities for the entire Department of Defense within days and then rolling them out quickly and accepting an extraordinary amount of what would have been a seemingly extraordinary amount of risk before that, risk with regard to rollout and contracting and then security risks. What type of business are we doing over these things in ways that we would have been wary of before? So yes and no, honestly. And I think it's been, if anybody who hasn't learned anything from this in a very positive sense probably hasn't been paying attention.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true. So there's a lot of speculation, of course, about what comes next. How we return to normal, assuming that we're actually going to return to what we experienced before. But no one really knows how this is going to play out. While some agencies have begun sending some people back to the office, a lot of agencies are really going, very slowly and deliberately and carefully because of the risk. So given that we're not going to see some switch where things just, okay, everybody goes back to their commutes and their work, how do you anticipate this evolving over the next few weeks and months? Do you have a sense of what we might see?
As I understand it, there's OPM guidance out, and it's been out for a little while, about the phases that departments should consider themselves in as they conduct return to work sites, workplaces. What I found interesting is that the phase 1 and phase 2, where we are and where some agencies are going, are very much the same with regard to the precautions, the adjustments to workspaces and facilities, and what people do in them. It's a matter of how many people may find themselves being required or asked to go in, and when they need to go in, and how often they need to go in based on their roles and what they need to access. I try not to bring too much of my personal impression as to the situation we find ourselves in. I don't know that the state of play that we find ourselves in with regard to the coronavirus is going to change anytime soon. With regard to the risk of exposure for different people, transmission paths not being completely understood yet, and the precautions that can be applied other than the ones that we know right now, which are masks, distancing, cleaning, washing of hands, and the like. So I can't foresee personally, with no special insights, that the situation we find ourselves in now is going to change for perhaps a year. until things such as a widespread vaccine becomes available. And we may have to at some point go back again if we find out a potential vaccine isn't long-term effective and requires a new wave of vaccination and the like. It's going to be a continual learning experience, I think, for what we might consider at least the midterm, if not the long term. So I think we know, and we're gaining a better appreciation of the risk environment that we're operating in, which then I think shifts the attentions of department, agency, and all the way down to office leaders and managers to begin to understand how they best operate and achieve their missions inside of a relatively known risk environment over the long term.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what's been interesting about the OPM guidance is how really flexible it is and how much leeway it gives local administrators and managers and supervisors the flexibility to go really very, very slowly here, which makes sense in this situation. I was also interested that in a panel earlier today in the conference, the deputy IG at NASA mentioned that NASA is being very cautious. They're still in 100% telework mode, and they have begun discussions on employee manager work groups to talk about how they might move forward, but they're proceeding very, very cautiously. So if a high-tech agency like NASA can, maintain this posture, it really it sends a message that other agencies will probably proceed very, very slowly as well. So one of the reasons we wanted to talk to you is your work on the commission. You've really explored the future federal workforce, the future of public service, and so I'm wondering how you look at government's workforce needs evolving in the context of this pandemic.
One of the things, thank you. So our commission was asked to look at public service to the nation writ large. We were asked to first consider the future of the military selective service and who registers for that. And as our name describes, we were asked to look at ways to increase Americans' understanding of and participation in military service, the all-volunteer force, national service, things like AmeriCorps and Peace Corps, AmeriCorps and national service having really gotten a lot of attention since the pandemic hit and how to respond to it. And then public service, not just the federal government, but state, local, and tribal governments. The principles involved in them are very much the same, and the dynamics, the pressures that they face are very much the same. We made a total of 164 discrete recommendations in our report to Congress, which we turned in on March 25th, right after the pandemic hit, and we all retreated from it. It's available, I should say, online at www.inspire, the number 2, or should do it that way, the number 2 serve.gov, inspire2serve.gov. You can find our report in there. We had 164 discrete total recommendations. 38 of those are for public service, so just about a quarter of them. They're focused primarily on the federal civil service, since that's the sending a report to Congress is the place that Congress is responsible for those laws. But a lot of the themes in those recommendations apply to all levels of service. And what we looked at was not the size of agencies or agencies' roles per se. That wasn't our mission. Our mission was about our responsibility was to look at the people involved. And we all know that people are probably the most capable, the most important asset that any organization has, including NASA, right? The military, for the billions and millions of dollars and all the systems of all kinds that I worked with and that the department works with all the time, it's the people that are actually the most expensive thing because they are the most important and precious thing. And the federal government has long been understood to be in dire straits with regard to the workforce for a lot of reasons. Decades and decades of policies that have made sense at the time, but now they've all been mixed in and come to play as the commercial economy around us changes and society around us change. That many of the policies just aren't optimal or super effective in the current state, and lots of professional academic and organizations, some chartered by Congress, such as the National Academy for Public Administration. There are a lot of reports out there. A lot of people write all the time about these factors and these issues, and they are directly reflected in our report because we made them sit in a room and talk to us for hours on end, and we read their reports. And what we really did was take a lot of these known recommendations and put them into a broad context under a theme of how can people understand what government does, what the opportunities for them as individuals are to work in government, to make their own communities and their own nation a better place, and how they can actually access those opportunities. Because that's one of the greatest difficulties that the government itself faces, is people don't even know what's available to them and how to pursue those opportunities. My personal phrasing or appreciation of the government workforce is there's kind of a ticking demographic bomb inside the workforce. 1/3 of federal civil servants can retire within the next 5 years. That's staggering. If you told somebody in the military or another organization, all of those people, the third can be gone in 5 years, and that because they can leave, because they can retire, that means they're the ones who've been there the longest and have the most experience, and they could evaporate in just a handful of years. Meanwhile, the youngest cohort, the percentage of folks in the federal government under the age of 30 is 6%. That is less than or about half of what it is in the wider economy. So that the next generation of leaders are vastly underrepresented in there. And meanwhile, the folks that you want to fall behind them have a very poor appreciation or no appreciation of serving in government, whether it be federal or state and local. I think it's a 2013 survey stated that only about barely 5%, I think, of soon-to-be college graduates had thought or considered a career in federal government. Maybe 7% thought of state or local government, and everybody else was looking at the nonprofit sector or the for-profit sector. So government doesn't get much attention. And folks who do think about it consider it to be a very difficult thing, a hard thing to pursue. And they're not wrong in that way. So all of the factors that exist today have been put on steroids, amplified, made more complex. Some of them are now already in 3 months moving faster than they were before coming into play. So it's an important time for government. The next few years could be very impactful as to how government is perceived as a performer and as a place to start and spend a career.
One of the things that's, to me, going to be very interesting going forward is how employee expectations have changed as a result of this, as well as how managers perceive the workforce. And specifically, I'm thinking in terms of telework. In fact, we have a question about this. Many agencies under the Trump administration have been pulling back on telework. They've wanted to see more people in the office during very prescribed, hours. Very unlike the private sector, which has been evolving to give employees more flexibility about how they manage their workload and their time within the framework of meeting a mission. And the pandemic has really forced government to make telework work. It's also forced government to be more flexible in the way that much of the private sector has been for a while. It seems unrealistic to me that agencies are going to revert to some previous, less flexible, rules-based structure when the expectations of their employees will have changed. And also, I would expect that manager's vision of how the work can get done has been broadened. So I don't know if you have any insight into that and the necessity of that shift based on your research.
I agree with what you've just said. Our report indicates, and as was learned by others before we even came into being in 2017, that federal agencies were not meeting their own and their prescribed telework, remote work targets in the amount of work being done remotely. Various reasons for that. They could be higher directive, individual reluctance to use it, perhaps technical challenges that may have made folks shy from embracing it in the way that it was intended to be embraced. And that played an important part even before the current situation, the new reality, I don't use that lightly, where folks' appreciation of government, because remote work, right now I think about, I just saw it, 25% of all American workers work from home in some way, shape, or form, whether they be small business people or people who work for a company or an organization, but predominantly work from home, as many of us have just started to do for the first time in my life, for instance. But that ability for that flexibility was one of the key issues that gives folks a low appreciation of the opportunities in federal government. The federal government is unlikely to ever seriously compete with the private sector based on pure compensation. Mm-hmm. And we don't address compensation, direct compensation in our recommendations. What we do address related to that are a modernization of benefits, the ability for more employee choice and things like that. But with compensation, the thing that has always been the government's advantage or unique advantage for many prospective and serving employees has been mission. The ability to do something that's interesting, that's different, that you can't necessarily do on the outside, or you can't do it with the degree of import in terms of change and the like, or some technologies just aren't available that people really want to work in. But it's about the mission of serving your neighbors, your community, and your nation, that can help close the deal for the kind of talent that our nation needs to serve us in the public service. But that leap of not being able to work from home over the long term, to a degree commensurate, that the private sector will only increase. It's cheaper, it's safer, it'll be even more attractive. Every person's life, their work-life balance has become infinitely more complicated for them. Yeah. Whereas before, you might have had a handful of employees or workers or teammates that might have had concerns that caused you to pay them, not in a negative sense, but you had to accommodate them because they had a child care, health issues, and the like. Now everybody may very well have something that drives them to have a need to be able to work from home for some period of time that they never did before. And if we get a reputation, if the federal government gets a reputation for not being as accommodating as big tech or just local tech concern or whatever industry it is, that I can just, the old BYOD, on my own devices, I can stay connected, I can stay a performer, I can keep advancing in my career and do work, but that option's not as equal, or I'm uncertain about it, because all it is, it doesn't have to be truth, it just has to be an impression. Then we lose the opportunity to have a conversation with people about serving their country in public service, and that's going to be to all our detriment.
Right. Have you seen any innovations with regard to telework in the classified arena?
Not specifically, no. Not thus far. Of all the things that move the slowest are things that regard classification, right, and the like, because it takes so much risk assessment and risk elimination to employ those, to even put in those capabilities is a very lengthy process that requires a lot of permissions. But I think what it has raised up from my observation, my personal experience, is the complications of the fact where you had a set sort of capability for folks who needed to do classified work that met your operational paradigm in mid-March is your biggest drawback now. some of the work I'm involved in, and that is it's a major hurdle. Because folks can't convene, folks can't spend as much time as they need to. Folks can't travel when folks would normally get into a room for a day or 2 days and close the skiff doors, and lots of big work and thinking happens. You can't do that.
Right.
Not anytime soon. And those are things that are workarounds are being found, but also the workarounds are limited when it comes to classified information, classified related work. So that's going to be a challenge, and that's surmountable. And probably the greatest challenge with that is time. You can't affect the time of increasing your classified capabilities too much. And if you want more of them, basically you have to break out your checkbook, and it's relatively steep to gain those capabilities. But those are the kinds of assessments that need to be made over the near term.
Right. And my guess would be the agencies for whom those solutions are most valuable tend to be the agencies with the most resources, and they will be more highly motivated to find those solutions, perhaps.
I agree, but it's also interesting that some of the biggest agencies with the biggest budgets don't have an equal level of capability across their entire organization, where they have many pieces that the distributed organization had just enough, and that just enough is now nowhere near enough for what needs to be done, relative to if you work in the Pentagon and you can get into the Pentagon per se, you can pretty much do whatever you need to. But if you're working with someone in a lab or on a base or an installation somewhere just a few states away, other side of the world, like you would routinely do, they might not have the same type of access that allows them to maintain the routine contact that you had before, and therefore work and schedules have automatically begun to slide, and expectations are being readjusted all the time.
Right. And it is important to remember that there are many positions in the federal government and contractor space that cannot be done remotely. They have to be done in a lab or in a secure setting. So there's a sizable percentage of the workforce that, where the flexibilities are inherently limited, certainly right now, and will continue to be, I would expect. We do have a question that I think gets to a really important issue, and that is around employee expectations and comfort level. Right now, a lot of people are not comfortable for very good reasons returning to an office. And I'm wondering what kind of challenges that's going to present for some agencies or some units within agencies, and sort of how you see agencies dealing with that discomfort level among the workforce.
I've given that a bit of thought. I think everyone who is a leader or a manager or a combination of the both has their skill set has been challenged significantly to date, and it's going to continue to be challenged for quite a long time. I made mention of it before, how most people who lead teams, organizations of whatever size and whatever complexity, always had an appreciation as to a good one, leader or manager, had an appreciation for what it took to maintain the effectiveness of their team, in whatever that might be, work hours, time off, approving work from home, in whatever your paradigm was at the time. And for the most part, we look at our fellow workers as the individual we see, unless they're an acquaintance or a friend. We might not know too much about their family situation. We might know they live in Maryland, they live in Montgomery County, they live in Rockville. But now, if you're a leader or a manager and even a coworker, you might find out over the web that they have two very small children that you didn't appreciate before. Then they have a large dog. You get to see those things, but then why would I have any cause to know that a colleague of mine that isn't necessarily close to me, that their child is immunocompromised, or that they have or that they have a parent or another family member that lives with them that has a challenge that affects their ability to go into work where everybody else could. Or when we open things up again, they depend on mass transit that may not be turned on or accessible to them. Everybody's situation now is not just the employees or the teammates. It's what is their broader family situation. So a person has gotten a lot of attention, I would think correctly and laudably so. The Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, and a lot of the talk about her frank, transparent, and empathetic leadership with an entire nation, several million people, being key to how New Zealand dealt with their challenge locally. Everybody has to learn transparency. I would offer has to learn and practice transparency and empathy for everyone as individual employees with unique circumstances that didn't come to bear before. I've always, I don't consider myself a nerd, but nerd adjacent. And in Dungeons and Dragons, they have the dice with the 10 or the 12 sides. And I've always had an appreciation that sometimes our colleagues, our coworkers only see one, two, or a couple of those sides of our life and our personality and our situation. Now, all 12 sides of that die is in play for teammates and managers, and they matter as to your ability to contribute, your ability to plug in, your ability to go in. And it's going to be that way for quite some time. And people who want to join the public service or people that you want to hire now bring all 12 sides of their die to the equation in there, which means it becomes more important to understand people and to try. The word accommodate can be kind of fraught, but you have. So I don't envy anyone their specific challenges, but it's something that everyone has to rise to.
Right. I think, we're dealing with people, having to deal with people, not just as individuals, but within their ecosystem, right? The public schools, the public transit, the health of their family members, the people they live with. All of these things beyond the individual are factors in how agencies move forward. And I don't believe that's ever really been the case before, not on this mass scale.
One thing I'd also add in that what each person's situation is, someone could have been your top performing employee, teammate, because they're predominantly in the office space with all the resources and assets, and they work their full complement of time, and they might not even have any particular challenges, but if you can't get in for these different reasons, broadband is not assured. Reliable broadband is not assured to everybody. Only 15% of the federal workforce works in the greater Washington, D.C. area of the contiguous counties out there, whereas the federal workforce is distributed across the nation and in some pretty remote places, in places out there. Is it incumbent upon the employee to have that access, and where there never been an issue with them before, but they have unreliable connection and they don't, some systems require some bandwidth and reliability and bandwidth and don't like it when it hiccups and it kicks you out and you can't do your work. I've seen some writing on that as to what do you do about people who need quiet place to do their work, but now you're talking about becoming aware of their home environment and how it affects their work. Mm-hmm. It becomes their workspace and how it affects their ability to do work when nobody, frankly, it was none of anybody's business whether or not you lived in a a noisy apartment building and your neighbor has a dog. It might make my nights more sleepless, but now it could affect what I'm able to do.
Right. And you bring this up as neighbors mowing their lawn. So I apologize. Apologies to anyone who can hear that. We have a question from someone, and that I think it's a very good question, but and I don't know if you'll be comfortable answering it, but what should employees do if their managers insist on their return to the office, and that employee has demonstrated an ability to work from home? Is there a way forward there? How would you advise that person?
I think everyone, no matter where they work, needs to understand what their organizational policies are with regard to redress, communicating with your supervisors, understanding what the policies are to raise issues in government and in some companies. That's employee resources groups. And some government agencies have unions in that way, and knowing your organization there and asking about them ahead of time, even if you don't have them. Understand what that process is to understand what I'm going through it now in my own company. We just received a professional survey as to to understand the state of the employees' concerns with regard to home life, homework balance, and returning to facilities of different types, whether they be company or government or what have you. I think it really requires individuals to be proactive and figure out what are my supervisors asking me or telling me that I can say and when, and making sure that you understand that. And there are resources out there as to understanding opportunities and assistance, which I would encourage folks to try basic internet searches about employee redress.
Right. I think we have to wrap it up there, but that's a really important point for everyone. Know your organization's policies and recognize too that those policies could change rapidly as the situation evolves. So this is very much learning mode, I think, for everyone at every level of government right now. So thank you very much, Sean, for joining us and bringing your expertise to this issue. And for the audience, thank you for being here. That concludes our final session in today's Testing Government's Connection event. As the federal government grapples with the unknown duration, scale, and permanence, potentially, of the transition to remote work, these conversations are incredibly timely. So thank you to the audience for tuning in and for sending in your questions. The full webcast has been recorded and you'll receive a link, so please watch for that in your inbox and feel free to share it with your colleagues. So thank you, everyone, and hope to see you next time.